Before we start, Andy, I just wanted to say a quick thank you to our podcast sponsors, Money Farm. Now, Money Farm are the largest digital wealth manager in Europe, and they create portfolios of ETFs for their clients. They're incredibly cheap and ideal for somebody who's wanting to get into investing, and perhaps for more experienced investors who don't actually want to run their own money anymore. Now, they will even offer to run the first £20,000 of any of our listeners' portfolio absolutely free if they enter the code MTTM20K into the website at moneyfarm.com. For more information, check out their website. But for now, Andy, let's get back on with the show.
Hello and welcome to episode 171 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert as always, Damien Fay, and me, Andy Leakes. Damien, welcome back. You really look fighting fit now. You've shifted this illness right out.
Well, funny you say that, Andy, because midweek I suddenly seemed to acquire a second cold. But I have, as you say, I now, today is the best I've felt in a couple of weeks. So
you're looking great, mate.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, you're really good for the ego. Yeah, so I'm feeling good and very up for this week's podcast. What about you?
Yeah, I'm fighting fit, to be honest. I've been, I suppose, in the last week, all I've really been doing is concentrating on growing my beard.
Yeah, Andy has got a beard now. It seems to be compulsory if you're going to be on the Money to the Masses podcast to have a beard. But Andy's one of those guys who could grow a beard in about 10 minutes. So
I came out of the womb with a 5 o'clock shadow.
He did. It's quite impressive. I'm jealous. So yeah, it's a very nice beard, Andy. Looking very very trim. You've shaped it and everything. Maybe we should dye them in Money to the Masses colours.
In a little spoiler, we I don't know whether we should do this too early in the podcast, but listeners may actually get the chance to be able to comment on the beards, Damien.
Let's spoil it, because Andy and I are going to be Facebook living. So we're going to do a Facebook Live video next week. So we're going to throw it out there. It's the first time we're going to try this, and it will be Tuesday at 8:30. So go on
Tuesday
to Facebook.
the 27th around 8:30 p.m. There we go.
Yeah. So we'll keep pushing stuff out on Twitter and, well, obviously Facebook, telling you when we're going to do it. But I know I was talking recently about trying to do something else midweek that may be more contemporary than what we do on the podcast, because I try and make the podcast evergreen so people can listen to it in years' time and still get value. And a number of you said you liked the idea, and actually Andy came up with the Facebook Live idea, and it's something we've wanted to do, Facebook Live. So what will happen, it will be me and Andy talking, possibly about markets, possibly about doing questions, contemporary things in the money news, anything. So you'll be seeing us chatting together and you can join in. So please join that, even if it's just to write hello and on the comments. It's something we're going to try on a weekly basis and evolve and see how it goes. I think it should work, and nobody else out there is really doing anything like it. So that will be Tuesday at 8:30, but do bear with us because it's going to be the first time we do it.
So in order to join that, make sure you go onto Facebook and you find the Money to the Masses page. So in order to join that broadcast and be notified that Damien is broadcasting live on Tuesday, you will need to like Damien's page. So go onto Facebook.com, you know where to go, and type in Money to the Masses. You'll find Damien's page there, and make sure you like it and follow his page. That way you should get a notification when we go live.
Exciting.
Yeah. What have we got coming up on this week's pod?
Well, Facebook is quite topical because it has sparked a stock market rout this week, or a sell-off. I'm only going to mention this very briefly. This isn't one of the pieces on the podcast, but it seems like I should. Maybe I'll pick up on it in the Facebook Live chat. So I might just quickly talk about what's going on in the markets just to stop people panicking. I want to talk about giving unlimited amounts of money to people free of inheritance tax. I want to talk about an investment piece to do with star fund managers. You know, the guys who can walk on water, or the ladies who can walk on water. There are fund managers out there who attain cult-like status, and people follow them from fund to fund and give them their life savings freely. And I did some research with 80/20 Investor this week, which has been published, which looked at that phenomena and whether those star managers are actually any good and deserve your loyalty. So I'm going to touch upon that. And the last piece is something to do with travel insurance. Now, it's a topical piece because it's the time of year where people will start looking about booking holidays, and there are things to watch out for on travel insurance. So there you go. But before we go on to the podcast, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to a couple of people. There was Gavin Harvey who sent me an email, which I will respond to after this podcast, saying how much of a fan he is of this podcast, and missed me when I wasn't here that week. So that was always nice. Andy P, good name, Andy. Andy P sent a very long email, actually, responding to last week's podcast where I was talking about Revolut and apps that can be used. Remember the digital-only banks? That was a popular piece, and in fact, the Mirror, of all papers, picked that up and ran with it, so you can see parts of that in the Mirror online. He was talking about Revolut, actually. He's a big fan of it. He thinks it's the cheapest way to take money abroad. If you don't know what I'm talking about, then go back to last week's episode. One thing I will quickly mention is I said there was no limits on the withdrawals on Revolut when you go abroad and take money out of a cash machine. There are, in fact, so it's the same as Monzo. I nearly forgot that name, Monzo. So the limit is about £200 a month. The other person I just want to say a quick hello to is, well, a review we had, Andy, so I feel like I should read that out. And the review was from Issy D. Not. I do like the names people put on iTunes, and the title was Easy with an exclamation mark. Great way to learn about money, easy to understand and follow. If not easy to read out. I could see you were thinking the same thing, Andy. So yeah, let's crack on with this week's podcast.
Good. So you mentioned at the start, it's not really part of the podcast, but you feel like you should mention it. Did you want to talk about how Facebook has sort of screwed the markets?
Well, I just want to throw it out there. People may have noticed that the stock market has tanked quite a bit this week, and two of the reasons are, one of them that sparked it is Facebook. Facebook, as you probably all know, has been under a lot of pressure because it allowed a third-party academic company to use data from users, and it ended up being that they had access to data from 50 million users, which they used apparently to somehow help or influence the American election. There's all sorts of allegations of which it's hard to understand which are true, but of course that caused the Facebook share price to completely tank. It fell by, it's below, I think, 10% of where it was at the start of the week. And this is a big story, principally because it's all our data, which we didn't realise was being used in this way. But I don't think Facebook is about to implode, despite the fact that people are talking about there's going to be regulation and perhaps rules that are going to be brought in by governments to try and control what these social media giants are doing. But when you've got 1 billion people using a product, it's not going to go away overnight. But what was interesting is that the tech giants out there have been driving a lot of this stock market rally. So the cracks have started to show in their rally, which has therefore impacted the rest of the market, because in America, technology stocks now make up about 25% of the major indexes, so the S&P 500, which is an equivalent level that we had way back in the dot-com bubble before that burst, and therefore their share of that, the indexes, fell. So it was one of the catalysts. Donald Trump then waded in with a trade war. He started chucking around tariffs and attacking China. And one of the reasons that I mention this is because if you go back a couple of podcasts, you remember I did a special podcast talking about how China controls the American economy. Go back and listen to that, because China are probably going to retaliate to this trade war, and with the tariffs that Donald Trump is apparently going to impose on certain things that are imported from China, China are looking like they may start devaluing their currency or other things. And as I said, when the bank manager is, in this case China, if you don't really want to upset your bank manager, because he can do all sorts of nasty things to you, so we may see that. So again, go back and listen to that podcast. I'm not going to go in any more detail, but what I would say to people is have a look at the levels I talked about on the American stock market a couple of weeks ago. We have fallen through some of that, and on the FTSE 100, we have gone below 7,000, which is particularly negative sign. So I think we might have a bit more downside before the market finds a bottom. But as we stand, there is a lot of uncertainty and people are slightly overreacting to what's going on out there. So it's an exciting time to be in investment markets. I know they are seemingly heading south, but there's a lot of noise, and focus on those technicals where I told people to get a ruler out and see where the support lines are. As I talk on this podcast, in America especially, we haven't quite broken the uptrend of stocks. That may change by the time I get to the end of this podcast and the weekend, but at the moment we haven't quite hit Armageddon. So just So people don't panic just yet anyway. So that's what I wanted to say on stock markets. Let's go on to the piece on inheritance tax.
Yeah, that's what I was going to suggest. Inheritance tax next. And as sad as it is, this is kind of touching at my heartstrings because I sadly lost my nan last week, and my mum and dad have been having to deal with all sorts of complications with houses and money and things like this. So I'm going to be all ears listening to this because, it's actually hit me this week.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that because that's the first time I've heard that that happened. So my condolences on that, Andy. But one of the things that is this is also topical because I don't know if you remember, but recently Ken Dodd died, and one of the big stories that came out at the end is, I don't know if anybody can remember as far back as the early 80s, but Ken Dodd had a run-in with the taxman, and he was accused of basically not paying the tax that was owed and trying to evade tax. It was a big court case, and I think he was actually cleared of it in the end, and then he got his career back on track. But he was always portrayed as somebody who perhaps wanted to pay as little tax as he could. Now, the reason this is topical, because on his deathbed almost, Ken Dodd decided to marry his long-term partner. And one of the reasons that has been put out there that he did it was a last laugh at the taxman, because obviously anything you pass to your spouse is free of inheritance tax. So there were people who claim, I don't want to say it, but the people who've been in the press claiming that it was a case that he married her because he could therefore pass things on to her without there being any inheritance tax, which I think is quite sensible and also quite funny. In a kind of last two fingers to the taxman as you depart this world. But what I wanted to mention was an inheritance tax rule that lots of people don't realise, that means you can actually pass unlimited amounts to people free of inheritance tax. Now, we all have an inheritance tax allowance. We can pay $3,000 a year in total gifts to people that we want to, and there are some caveats on things like wedding gifts that you have an allowance for that. And of course there is the general allowance that if you die you have an annual allowance which you can pass on to people without paying inheritance tax, but that currently sits at £325,000 per person, so you get double that if you're a married couple, so £650,000. I don't want to focus on that and what happens when you die and you're above that amount. I mean, there's a 40% tax amount. Inheritance tax that is. What I'm more interested in is the rule that people are normally unaware of, that while they're alive, they can make unlimited gifts to people if they follow certain rules. Now, if you normally make a gift to somebody, there's a 7-year rule, which if you die within those 7 years, then you are going to probably be liable to some form of inheritance tax. It's a tapered amount, so they catch it because they think, oh yeah, well you probably had an inkling you were going to die, so you started paying money away. I think 7 years is you'd be quite a mystic if you knew you were going to die within 7 years, I suggest, but unless you, of course, you were very unwell. But if you were a millionaire, you could pass a almost unlimited amount to people as long as you paid it as part of your normal expenditure, and it was a regular amount out of income, not capital, and it left you enough to maintain your normal standard of living. Now, that's the definition. So, give you an example. If I had a certain amount of money that was income that was coming in, I didn't need, and it could maintain my standard of living, I could start giving it to whoever I wanted as long as it was a regular amount. So if I particularly liked you, Andy, I could every so often, every month or whatever, pay a regular amount, and even if that ended up being millions, let's imagine I had lots of money, it ended up being millions, the taxman couldn't do anything about it, even though he'd be sitting there twitching at the fact that you've just been given millions and they can't come back with any rules and say that I owe you inheritance tax. And that's because it's part of this rule that you can give away regular amounts. Now, the guidance on this rule is very vague, so one thing you certainly couldn't do, in Ken Dodd's example, he couldn't just go, oh, do you know what, I'm going to start giving regular amounts to a certain person. Oh, look, I've just died. There you go, I only managed to do one of them. HMRC would see through that. They'd go, well, that wasn't regular, was it? You can't say you're about to do it and then pass on to the next world. So they need to see evidence that it's a regular amount. The other thing is that it has to come from income. Now, income can include rent or savings interest or even dividends or, of course, general income from employments. There have been cases where they said it didn't include income from certain investments like bonds. So as long as you stick within those limits, you can in fact give regular amounts freely to whoever you want, and you just need to be able to demonstrate that they were regular. But that means you need to have P60s, bank statements, tax returns, because when that person dies, HMRC will come looking and start seeing if you fall foul of that 7-year rule and start saying, no, those gifts now are liable to inheritance tax. But if you can demonstrate the fact that they were regular, they're out of income, and they were left the person with a normal standard of living, then you can have all that money tax-free. So it's something to look at. That may be, there are people who listen to this podcast who may be older and then may start thinking they wanted to leave some money to their next of kin. Well, this is one way of doing it. There you go.
Before we move on, Andy, I just wanted to quickly mention 80/20 Investor. Now, 80/20 Investor is my DIY investment service. Do go and check it out. I empower and teach people how to invest their own money. The service provides data-driven fund tables. The data is driven by my own unique 80/20 Investor algorithm, which I created. You also get stop-loss alerts, you get research articles and insight, you get market commentaries, monthly commentaries, and DIY investment lessons, but you also get access to my £50,000 portfolio, which is a portfolio of my own money, which I run live on the site for members to see, and it shows people how I use the service to maximise my returns. And in the first 2 years of doing so, I turned £50,000 into £59,500, which is a 19% return, beating investment managers, professional fund managers, financial advisors, investment banks, passive trackers, and the market. So everybody can have a free 30-day trial of 80/20 Investor, and you can claim that by going to moneytothemasses.com and going and clicking on the 80/20 Investor hyperlink at the top of the page. So go and try the service. Let me know what you think of it, and I know from the feedback that you're going to love it. But for now, on with the show.
Okay, moving on to the investing part. So we talked about star managers, those people with halos, people that walk on water that people don't seem to ever want to walk away from, or, you know, they are the stars. You're going to talk about some research you've done and whether it actually truly is worth following these guys, these messiahs.
Yeah, and one of the most famous messiahs is Neil Woodford, and he was a guy who used to work for Invesco Perpetual and ran a couple of income funds. £32 billion was in those funds at the height of his powers. Now, he left, I think it was in 2014, set up his own funds, and the world went bonkers. There was lots of fund platforms who realised they could make lots of money out of these new funds and promoted them heavily, and loads of people followed him because he's one of those things, almost like any other sort of walk of life. Maybe if it's a rock star or whatever, their legend seems to grow to the point where for Neil Woodford, it was claimed he dodged the dot-com bubble, he dodged the financial crisis. I think there was elements of truth in that, but really he focused on a particular type of investment. He was quite into defensive, so they were things like pharmaceutical companies or tobacco companies, and they weren't really impacted in those sell-offs. So he made a lot of money for a lot of investors, and the problem is with a lot of managers, or all managers, every dog has its day. So there'll be periods where people like Neil Woodford will do brilliantly, there'll be periods where they won't. And so 80/20 Investor is all about picking those people at the right time, or trying to. And I decided to look at some research into star managers and whether there was any evidence that actually some of them are worth just following around like you say, like the Messiah. Now, I'm not going to give away what the complete research, because that's obviously for people who are 80/20 Investor members. If you want to see it, you can take out a free trial and you can find out. But I will give you some snippets. So what I did is I went and found, obviously there's 2,000 managers out there. There's loads of them. And to try and work out who the star managers are, I drilled it down by looking at ratings that some people give to fund managers, say they are star managers, which is very subjective. But I got them, whittled them down, and it took me a hell of a long time, because in the end I had to go back and look at each manager's record, and I also had to therefore look at what they did when they left their fund and what their old fund did once they were gone, and compare the two. We got down to the point there was about 15, 16 of these people who could have been really have star-like quality, and or people said they did, Neil Woodford being one. Now, out of all those people, there were some that did seem to suggest that they had this star quality, that they'd done brilliantly at their last fund, they left that fund, and they'd done brilliantly again. But the problem is, that when you looked at the evidence as a whole, as a group, there wasn't enough evidence to suggest that a star manager will outperform in their new fund. Statistically, there wasn't any significance. And actually, the odds of somebody moving to a new fund and outperforming their old one is basically 50-50. They either do or they don't. And when you looked at the evidence, it was broadly along those lines. And in fact, even some of those who did outperform their old fund actually massively underperformed the benchmark of their peers. So they might have outperformed their old fund, but they still underperformed the average. So basically, they went from one sinking ship to another. Well, Neil Woodford was one of those. I don't mind mentioning that. So overall, the piece to take away is that star managers generally are not worth following. Their messiah status is largely a marketing exercise to try and get money from you. And there are some that have done well. I'm not going to name them. If you want to see it, go and look at the research. But the point is, if a fund manager leaves a fund, don't panic. You are better just reviewing the fund itself and just deciding whether you want to keep it or not, because generally speaking, you are not going to be better off necessarily blindly following them. So there you go. A nice piece of research that I thought I would just give a teaser to podcast listeners.
Lovely stuff. Okay, travel insurance. What have we got?
Right, I'm conscious of the time, so we will not dwell on travel insurance. But travel insurance is one of those things that is topical. The first tip I'm going to just say, this isn't the piece, but as an aside, if you book a holiday, you should take out insurance as soon as you book it, because there's no point taking out insurance almost on top of you're going to go away, because what happens if you suddenly were taken ill or something happened, that there was a strike announced by an airline, because they wouldn't be paid out, because insurances will only pay out based on the information that was available at the time that you took out the policy. So if you take out the policy and let's say an airline had announced a possible strike at that point and that strike occurred, then the insurance company wouldn't pay out. So if you book a holiday, book the travel insurance at the same time, or perhaps get an annual policy because it can be cheaper if you plan on going on a number of holidays. But travel insurance is one of those things that should be simple but isn't, because there's so many differences on the policies. And also, every holiday is different. And one of the things I think people need to look at is that if they buy an annual policy, don't just assume that it will cover them regardless of the holiday they go on. And I'm going to highlight a few ridiculous exclusions that people might not realise. Now, one of them is country exclusions. Now, there are some travel policies out there that will exclude places like Bermuda, Canada, Hong Kong and Mexico because they deem them too dangerous. I do not know why Canada is classed into that category. That seems slightly odd to me. But different policies will have different exclusions. So you need to check the small print before you buy them, or if you are booking a holiday, realise that your travel insurance does not include those places and therefore buy additional insurance before you go away. Now, the other one that may seem surprising is America. Now, America can be excluded on some policies because of the high level of medical costs. So, I don't know, I've been in America and become unwell, and you had to, nothing serious, just a bit of earache or something, and then you go down and have to see a doctor and everything. You have to pay for it, and it is hideously expensive. So, travel insurance policies sometimes make exclusions, so you need to be aware which countries are included and which are not. Now, the other exclusion is drinking. Everyone likes to drink on holiday. For some people, that's part of the reason they go. But you have to be aware of whether a travel insurance policy will cover you in certain instances if you've been drinking. And I'm not talking about driving. I'm just talking about if you're had a good night out and you decide you're going to show off to the fairer sex and do something stupid and then end up in hospital. They may not pay out. So check what your travel insurance says about alcohol intake. Now, the other thing is dangerous activities. Now, there are bizarre exclusions on dangerous activities. You could get some cases where a travel insurance policy might cover something as bizarre as a banana boat ride, but not something as fairly mundane as playing hockey or going horse riding. So there is a strong case for you to plan what activities you're probably going to do when you go away and check whether your travel insurance policy covers them. Now, there are one or two others. I mean, terrorism is another one. There are some policies that won't cover terrorism and the cost of repatriating you back to the UK if you become injured. So check. Some of them, it's an additional add-on you have to pay for. So have a look at that. There's something called SAF, SAF, scheduled airline failure. So that's if your airline goes bust. Then some of the travel insurance policies don't include that automatically. In fact, a lot of them don't, and some again have it as an add-on. And that basically means if your airline goes bust, then they would pay for the cost of your flight if they had that SAF included. So have a look for it. If not, you might have to pay an add-on, or of course pay for your airfare with a credit card. The other one is obviously age. When you get to a certain age, normally over 75, travel insurance policies also tend to have exclusions. And the last one I just want to mention before we finish this piece is that if you are having medical appointments, so let's say you were planning on going on holiday and you hadn't felt particularly well at a point in time, and you might have an annual travel insurance policy, so you're going to a doctor about something you think is nothing particularly important, and after a series of appointments and investigations it does turn out to be something a bit more serious, then your travel insurance policy might not pay out if you cannot go away on holiday as a result, because they will deem that you didn't disclose the fact that you had something wrong with you. Even though, as strange as that sounds, you didn't know you had something wrong with you. The fact you were going to a doctor, they may use it as evidence to exclude a claim. Now, that has happened. There was a case in the paper recently where a gentleman didn't realise he ended up having a form of cancer. He didn't realise that at the time, but was having appointments and therefore couldn't go on holiday, and the travel insurer didn't pay out. So just be aware of that, because you may have to update your travel insurance company, and if you're of course in doubt, then you should get in touch. But if you add all those things together, then it is one of the reasons why packaged accounts and the free travel insurance included needs to be carefully looked at, because some people just assume that, hey, I've got free travel insurance, but some of those dodgy things to look out for may be in those policies or missing. So there you go, Andy, travel insurance.
It's a really good piece, and I'm glad you mentioned packaged accounts at the end there, because I've actually been a benefactor of the positive side of a packaged account. Unfortunately, my daughter became unwell in a trip to Cyprus, and she was in hospital pretty much for the full week with bronchial pneumonia, believe it or not. And many thousands of pounds were spent on getting her better and getting her home. And I'm pleased to say that the packaged account that I did phone the insurance company before we went. I registered the holiday, registered who was going, and made sure that we were covered before we went. So I suppose that's another thing. If you have got a packaged account, don't just assume, like Damien said, but also give the provider a call before you go, double check the details, let them know where you're going, and you know exactly what you're covered for. Like I say, it saved me several thousands of pounds, and I was really pleased with it in the end. Good advice there, Andy. We're done for this week's podcast. Don't forget Facebook Live. Come and have a laugh at me and Andy trying to work out technology. And let us know who's got the best beard.
I was blatantly going to be Andy, and Andy has a magnificent beard. So come online, be part of it, say hello. We will answer questions, talk about topics that you want to be spoken about, and generally have a good time.
And again, that is Tuesday the 27th of March, 8:30pm. Nip onto Facebook right now and go and find Damien's Facebook page if you haven't already. Search for Money to the Masses. Click the like button or the follow button, whatever it is. Click both if there is both. And we'll see you on Tuesday. Obviously, if you want to get in touch with Damien about anything else, you can do. It's at Money to the Masses with a number 2. That's the Twitter address. And Damien at moneytothemasses.com if you've got an email you'd like to send him. Right, Damien, we're done. We're out of here. I'll see you on Tuesday. Until next week.
Oh, see you next Tuesday, Andy. I've waited 30 minutes to say that anyway. Juvenile. Right, till next week.
Don't forget to claim your free copy of Damien's best-selling book, The 30-Day Money Plan. Sort your finances in just 5 minutes a day, worth $4.99. Just go to moneytothemasses.com/podcast to find out how.